A Story of Hope by McKenzie. What the hell is going on? Eve said to herself as she rushed up the stairs at the local mental health inpatient unit. It was in the evening and Eve had just finished work. As Eve was rushing upstairs, taking care not to bump into anyone, her mind kept flashing back when she received a call earlier that day. The person on the other line said Susan had been sectioned. Eve had known Susan for close to a year, and even though there were challenges in the relationship, she was not prepared for this. Eve stopped to take her breath halfway up the stairs. Where am I now? Is this the second floor? Eve panicked as she rushed around. Eve looked around, only 2 people walking into another room, and they looked so busy. Eve had never been in a mental health hospital before. She did not know what to expect. Eve decided to not bother what looked like hospital staff as she poked her head around the corner of the door. Where is Ashburn Unit? Where is it? Eve turned around to walk down the stairs looking for any signs on the doors. She was sweating from all the rushing around, where she eventually stopped again to pause for breath. Just then she heard a noise of someone coming upstairs. This time Eve called out to the person coming up the stairs. Am I near Ashburn Unit? Asked Eve. The person looked up from the stairs below Eve and smiled. Next floor up, then turn left. You can't miss. Thank you. Eve replied Eve was too tired to rush back up the stairs. Instead, she decided to walk, but at a faster pace. Feeling nervous, she felt unsteady on her feet. She almost tripped on one of the steps. Eve cursed to herself, but she quickly regained her composure and continued on with her journey. This day could not get any worse. I don't want to break my neck on these stairs. Eve looked up to look at the exit to find a sign posted Ashburn Unit. Eve pulled the door, which seemed heavy. Eve wondered why the door was so heavy to pull. She then turned the corner and headed towards the mental health unit. The door to the unit looked intimidating. Eve wondered if she would actually be let in, but she took a deep breath and pressed the buzzer. Eve waited for what seemed like an eternity. She peered through the window into the corridor of the unit. She could see a lady in a bright green dress looking down on the floor. Eve knew straight away that the lady was a patient. She looked very unwell and seemed not to pay Eve any attention. Eve pressed the buzzer to the unit a second time and waited. Still, no one came. It was completely silent. Eve took her mobile phone out of her pocket and looked at the time. How long do I have to wait? Eve muttered. Eve pressed the buzzer for the 3rd time. A lady inside the unit in the corridor looked up at Eve through the window and headed away from Eve in annoyance. Isn't anyone going to let her in? Why are things slow around here? The lady complained. It was not long before one of the ward staff came out of their office. Eve could make out the ward nurse say something to the patient in the green dress. The lady then pointed to Eve, who was still waiting outside the unit. The ward nurse walked towards the door, peered through the window, and then put his card against the first door. Eve stepped back. She was still sweating due to her nerves. The ward nurse then unlocked the second door and pushed it open. Hello? Who is this? Are you visiting? The patient ward staff member asked. I am here to see Susan. She was admitted to the ward today. The ward nurse then beckoned Eve to walk into the unit. Oh yes, come right in. Sorry to keep you waiting. Eve wiped her forehead. She was in total panic as she was not sure what she was about to experience. Eve tried very hard to remain calm, but the environment was overwhelming. She was not sure what to say or do. The patient in the green dress looked up at Eve and smiled for a second. It will be okay. It will all be okay. Eve nodded at the patient, not sure what to say. Eve was worried if she said anything wrong that she could upset the patient. Eve just did not want to be at the mental health unit, but she had to see Susan. She had to let Susan know that she was there for her. Is it safe to see Susan? Eve asked the mental health nurse. Should be okay. Let me check where she is. Can you follow me to the visiting area? The nurse replied. Eve nodded and followed the ward nurse. He walked fairly quickly as he seemed to be in a rush. Eve realized that the nurse must be very busy, which was probably why he took his time to answer the door. It was not long before Eve was shown the visiting room. The room was very bright and quite spacious. The ward nurse pulled open the door only to find the other patient had followed him. The nurse looked at Wendy. Wendy, can you go to the relaxation room? I am busy with a visitor. Why can't I have my mobile phone? I need to phone my mom, Wendy complained. Wendy, your phone is still charging. When it's charged, you can have it. Wendy grew furious. You keep saying it is charging, but I am fed up here and there is no one to talk to. They are all mad in here. The staff are mad. The people are mad. You can't get better in here. It's a madhouse. Wendy, please, go wait in the room. I will check on your mobile in a moment. Eve's heart was pounding in her chest. She felt something was going to kick off between the nurse and the patient. Eve walked quickly into the visiting room and sat down. Eve wiped more sweat from her face and around the back of her neck. You have been here before? The ward staff asked from outside the room. Eve shook her head. No, never. The ward nurse pointed to some leaflets in the corner of the room. You might want to take a look at that leaflet. It explains what to expect from our services at the inpatient unit. Eve stood up and headed towards the rack of leaflets. The ward staff turned around and headed up with Wendy following him. Meanwhile, Eve looked at the rack of leaflets. One leaflet read, Understanding Psychosis. Another leaflet read, Are you a carer? Eve was too stressed to pick up anything to read. She sat back down and waited. She wondered if anyone else was going to come into the room. Eve felt alone. Her mind flashed back to better times. Eve and Susan were sitting on the park bench holding hands. It must have been Sunday. Eve remembered the noise of children playing and everything was all right. Susan stroked Eve's hair and looked into Eve's eyes. What shall we do later, Eve? Susan asked. I don't know. I am fine just spending time here with you, Eve replied. Susan smiled at Eve and looked up at the sky. She felt free. She felt alive, and all the cares of the world were floating away. Do you see those birds in the sky? I wonder where they are going, asked Susan. They are going far away from this place. Maybe we should follow them, Susan. Eve laughed and squeezed Susan's hand tighter. Eve smiled as her mind flashed back to happier times. She felt a bit better until she remembered what else happened. Her mind drifted away again. As Eve and Susan were sitting on the park bench, they heard a male voice. Dirty lesbians. Eve sat up from the park bench and looked around. She could just see a middle-aged man walk off in the distance. Eve knew it was him. Just ignore them. Ignore them all. Susan smiled. Eve's mind was back at the ward. Her smile slowly faded away. That awful experience ruined everything. Eve wondered how was Susan so strong? How could she deal with what people say about their relationship? Susan was always the strong one. She always had the answers. Susan always took the lead. She made plans and Eve followed them. Eve felt safe with Susan, but something went wrong. What's going on? Eve thought to herself as she sat in the visitor's room. Eve got up and walked to the window. Just then she could see the male ward staff walked back towards the waiting area. Eve could make out a figure shuffling behind the nurse. It was Susan, but her face was pale and her eyes red. Eve gasped in shock. No, that can't be right. That can't be it. Eve peered harder through the window to double-check. It was Susan, all right. She recognized her clothes. Eve noticed Susan's hair had not been combed. God, no, oh no, why? Eve spoke to herself, her heart beating faster. The ward staff pulled up the door to let Susan in. Susan's head was looking down on the floor. She did not say a word, but slowly walked to the opposite end of the room to sit down, not once looking at Eve. Susan, you have a visitor. Your friend is here. Eve nodded at the nurse and knelt down to try to look Susan in the face as Susan was sitting down. Susan? Susan? It's me. It's Eve. Susan did not reply. Eve could not forget the look on Susan's face, complete sadness and despair. Eve turned to look at the nurse. Sir, do you know what happened? What she was in for? Eve asked the nurse. Maybe Susan could tell you. She asked us to call you, replied the nurse. Is that okay, Susan? Do you want to tell your friend? So she does not have to worry? Eve looked back at Susan, hoping she would answer, but nothing. Susan continued to look at the floor. Eve was not sure what to do. She wanted to hug Susan, but was afraid she would be pushed away. Eve wanted to say words of sympathy, but wondered if that would upset her. Eve decided to just sit next to Susan, but not too close. Maybe Susan might say something. "Hey, listen, I got a fair bit to do. I am going to leave you two here. Is that okay?" The nurse then left. Eve nodded. She could not find anything to say back to the nurse. She was about to burst into tears, but she had to be strong for Susan. It was her time to be sure of everything, but Eve was still not sure what happened. Eve turned to look at Susan out of the corner of her eye. Just then, Susan looked up off the floor and at the wall. Susan stared at the wall. Eve, in a confused state, also looked at the wall. It was silent, no noise, and the smell of the ward lingered. Cleaning fluid. It was strong. Eve could feel trauma coming along. The experience was too much. Too many things were happening. It was around 10 minutes of Susan and Eve both sitting in silence. Eve just did not say anything and decided to pick up a leaflet. With Eve being so distracted, she did not read anything in the leaflet, but was just waiting for Susan to say something. Eve only wanted to know what happened. Why was Susan put in the mental health unit? Just then, Susan spoke. "I am sorry." Eve dropped the leaflet on the side of the chair. She looked directly at Susan. "Sorry? Sorry about what, Susan? What happened?" Eve asked. Susan did not turn to face Eve. She just stared at the wall, no expression on her face apart from sadness. Eve wanted to try ask Susan again for an explanation. Anything would do, something to make sense of it all. What was going on? Eve wanted answers before she could go home. The worry was overwhelming, but nothing else came from Susan's mouth. Eve, waiting for a minute, turned around and picked up the leaflet again to pretend to read it. She put the leaflet down and picked up the magazine, but it was too difficult to concentrate. All Eve could do was look at the pictures. Just then, Eve could hear some shouting outside the room. It sounded like something was kicking out, perhaps a patient arguing with staff or someone arguing. Eve put the magazine down and sat back on the chair. Suddenly, Susan slowly got up and headed to the door. "Susan, wait. I think something is happening out there. Wait till it calms down." Susan ignored Eve and pulled open the door and slowly walked away. Eve got up to follow Susan, not sure what else to say. Eve was confused and wanted to find someone to help or some ward staff, but they looked busy trying to calm a patient down. It was not long before the male nurse walked out of his office and smiled at Eve. "How did the visit go?" the ward nurse asked Eve. "She is not speaking. I don't know what to do." Eve's face turned red with frustration. She wanted out of the place. She did not want to be in the unit anymore. The patient on the ward, Wendy, looked at Eve. "It will be all right. It will be okay. I have been here before. Things will be okay." The male nurse then looked at Wendy. "Wendy, wait at the other end, please. I just need to let her out." Wendy quickly got angry. "What? You think I am going to run off? You think I am going to escape? I won't get far. You people always bring me back here. Sectioned. Again and again, trapped in this mad house." Eve looked at the floor as the patient walked away from the exit of the ward unit. The nurse unlocked the door. His keys jangled with so much noise. So many keys, and the smell of the ward unit was still overpowering. It was not long before Eve was outside the unit. Clutched in her hand was a leaflet titled, "What You Need to Know as a Carer." Eve put the leaflet in her bag and headed off downstairs. As Eve walked out of the mental health hospital, she turned her head and looked back. The building seemed so quiet on the outside, but inside was a different story. Inside the inpatient mental health units, there was so much going on. Eve thought to herself, is it possible to have some form of recovery in there? Eve quickly turned away and headed home. It was all too much for now. It felt as if Eve had lost something. Now that Susan was very unwell in the hospital, Eve was not sure where to turn next, but she certainly wanted answers. It was not long before Eve was home. She unlocked her front door and let herself in. Eve sighed with a breath of tiredness and frustration. She threw her jacket onto the coat hanger and walked quickly to the sofa. Eve completely threw herself on the sofa and almost fell asleep. Eve was thinking in all sorts of directions. She was planning on when to visit Susan again, but was worried if their relationship would take a turn for the worst if Eve did not give Susan space. Eve also began to feel guilty. Maybe she could have done something to stop Susan ending up in the mental health hospital. What could it be, though? What could Eve have done differently? Eve sighed as she took her mobile phone out of her pocket. She had some idea of what could have been the cause. She took a deep breath and dialed a number. Eve held her breath as the dial tone rang through to the other line. Eve wondered what she was going to say to who she was calling. She was trying to keep her temper. A voice came from the phone. "Hello? Is that Eve?" Eve quickly confirmed. "Yes, Janet. Do you know what happened?" Yes, I know. They told me. And you know what? I am not surprised." Eve held her breath even more. She tried very hard not to lose her temper and wanted to give Janet time to explain things. It was always difficult with Janet. Susan's mother did not approve of her daughter. Janet did not approve of Susan's relationship. Eve had a feeling Janet was going to blame Susan for the state she was in. But this time Eve wanted to play fair. She wanted to find out what had happened, and maybe Susan's mother could shed some light. "What do you mean, Janet? Are you referring to Susan being in hospital?" "Of course I am. Do you not see? God punished her. My only daughter doing things like that?" Janet growled. At that point, Eve could not hold her voice back any longer. She had to explain things. Janet, let's not get diverted. How did Susan end up in there? What did the hospital tell you?" "She took something, didn't she? The silly bitch. They put her in there because she is a risk to herself," Janet barked on the line. "Janet, please, this is your daughter. Can we refrain from the name-calling?" Janet apologized. Okay, I am sorry, but that was stupid of her. That was weak of her. I am just angry. She let me down." Eve gripped her mobile phone tightly, hoping whatever she would say would not make things worse. Eve knew deep down inside that a wrong word could isolate Susan or cause more friction, making things worse for everyone. "Okay, so they said she took something? When was that? I visited Susan today and could not get much out from her." The voice on the other line grew angry. "Oh, I see. You still want to suck every bit of life left out of her. It's not enough she tried to kill herself. You want to finish the job." Eve was startled by Janet's accusation. "What do you mean? Don't you get it? You both are disgusting. You went there to continue your relationship with her. God punished her, and now God will punish you." Eve had enough. "Goodbye." Eve stopped the call, dropped her mobile phone to the floor, and sobbed. Eve cried as hard as she could. All the pent-up aggression, seeing Susan in that awful state, the continuing battle with Susan's mother. It was all too much. Eve could not help the way she felt about Susan. Only Susan understood her. Susan made Eve so happy, but now things came crashing down. Eve cried as she wondered if Janet was right. Was God punishing Susan? Was God punishing Eve? It cannot be this way. There was hope, and if anyone needed mental treatment, then it should be Janet, not Susan. How could someone be so cruel to their only daughter? Eve fumbled around in her bag for a packet of tissues. They were there somewhere. I only bought them a week ago. She eventually found the packet of tissues that were unopened. Eve tore into the packet, ripping some of the tissues inside the packet. She took some tissue paper and wiped the tears from her eyes. "I feel better now," Eve said to herself. She curled up on the sofa without a blanket and fell asleep. It was quiet. The cruel world had crept away and darkness slowly took its place. Eve felt better in the dark. She could hide, and she closed her eyes. Back at the hospital ward, Susan was also lying in her bed. The room was warm, but the noise of the mental health unit was awful. She could hear outside her door nurses talking to each other. They were discussing patient reports and working out who needs to do specific rounds on the ward. Susan curled up on her bed. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She felt alone and wondered if anyone in the world could help her. Susan felt she had failed herself. She was never good enough for her mother. Perhaps her mother was right. Maybe Susan was not good enough for this world. It was not long before the mobile alarm went off. 6:30 in the morning. Eve picked up the mobile phone and turned off the alarm. She slowly sat up and turned the TV on. "That bitch," Eve muttered as she got up and went to the kitchen. Eve turned on the kettle and made herself some coffee. "I guess I ought to try again. I guess I ought to visit Susan." Susan picked up the coffee cup and headed back to her room as she sat to watch the news. As usual, more bad news as the cost of living was getting out of control. More strikes I see are going to take place, Eve thought to herself. It's going to be difficult to travel with all these strikes, whatever next. Eve took a sip of the hot coffee. Each sip made her feel warm inside. She enjoyed her coffee, and at least her day was starting on a good note. Why am I so upset? It's not me that in the mental health unit. I ought to be ashamed of myself. I have got to get it together. It is my turn to be strong. Eve took another sip of the coffee. I just wish I knew what to do. Eve suddenly stood up and went out of the room. She headed straight to her jacket and took a leaflet out of the pocket. She looked at the leaflet again. What you need to know as a carer. Eve took the leaflet back to her room and sat down to read it. The leaflet was small and only had around 7 pages. There were several logos on the front of the leaflet. One of them was the NHS logo, another was a triangle. Eve flicked through the leaflet. It's hard to make sense of it all. I just don't understand it. Eve was frustrated. So much was on her mind. I know. I will take this to work. With those very words, Eve rushed back out of the room, took her jacket, and headed off to work. Several hours later, Eve was having her lunch in the park. She was glad to be outside. The weather was nice, but there was still sadness within her. I wonder how Susan is doing. I have not heard anything from the hospital. Eve took out her mobile phone to check for any missed messages or calls. There was nothing. Eve wondered if she should call the hospital. No, I need to find out how things are. Eve took the leaflet out of her bag and looked for the number of the hospital. The hospital had a list of mental health wards to call. Ah, that was the unit, Ashburn Unit. She quickly dialed the number. Hello, Ashburn Unit. How can I help? The operator asked. Oh, hi. I'm ringing to call about someone admitted yesterday. Eve replied. Maybe you can call the patient number. We do not really take calls from our office. Here is the number. The operator responded. Wait, is Susan around? Eve asked. Yes, I will call her, but please ring the patient phone. Okay, I will do that. Sorry, Eve said. Eve hung up and dialed the mental unit's patient number. She had to dial it a few times, but eventually someone picked up the phone. Hello? Who is this? A voice came from the phone. Eve recognized the voice. It was the Wendy, the other patient on the ward. Hello, Wendy? Is Susan there? Oh, you are that lovely carer for your friend. I will call her for you. Wendy replied. Eve waited a few moments on the other line. Eventually, she could hear breathing through the phone. It was definitely Susan. Susan? Susan? It's Eve. I just wanted to know if you were all right. Eve spoke reassuringly. There was no reply, just breathing down the other end of the line. Eve was not stupid. She knew full well that Susan wanted to say something, but was struggling to explain the situation. Eve knew Susan wanted to say she was sorry about the situation and did not want to let anyone down, but Eve could only hope Susan would reach out to her. I am sorry, Eve, Susan said softly. Not yet, Eve said quickly, but the phone line suddenly cut off. Eve felt she might have guessed correctly, however, she was just not sure. Eve needed reassurance that Susan wanted support and that she wanted help. Eve felt some relief that Susan at least said something, but at the same time there was dismay because it showed Susan was in a difficult place. At least there was some hope, just maybe not so soon. Eve got up from the seat in the park and headed back off to work. The next day, Eve decided to find out more information from the hospital unit. She would ring them just before lunchtime. While at the office, Eve kept an eye on the time. It was 11:30 in the morning. I better ring them now. Eve waited till everyone else was at lunch so she could have her conversation with the mental health professionals in peace. It was not long before the last staff member headed off to lunch. Eve picked up her mobile and rang Ashburn Mental Health Unit again. Hello, Ashburn Unit. How can I help you? The operator asked. Hi, I am Eve, friend of Susan. She is on your ward. Oh, yes, I remember you. It was you who called yesterday. Yes, it's me. Can you do me a favor? Who is treating Susan? I would need to talk to them, Eve asked. Give me a moment. They are doing ward rounds, so I am not sure if they have finished yet. Let me have a quick look, said the operator. Eve waiting for a minute as the nurse put the phone on hold. Eve could hear the muffles of patients and staff talking through the hallway of the unit. In the back of her mind, Eve figured it would not be long before she would try and visit Susan on that ward. Susan was not looking forward to that day, but she was not one to give up. It was not long before a voice on the phone. "Hello, Eve. This is Dr. Matthews. You are the named carer of Susan." "Hello, Dr. Matthews. I am sorry. I've got to find out how Susan is doing," Eve asked Dr. Matthews. "It's not too bad, Eve. She is improving and we have a ward round next week. Susan would very much want you to attend," the doctor responded. "Okay, what's a ward round? What is a carer?" "Oh, I am sorry, Eve. It is a session where we get updates on how the patient is doing regarding their mental illness. We also develop care plans and check what support is available." There was a pause from Eve as she tried to take in what Dr. Matthews was talking about. "As with you being the carer, it was changed to yourself. Would you be okay with this?" asked the doctor. "Yes, doctor. I am happy to be the carer, but I am not sure what it involves." "Well, if you can come to the ward round next week, we can advise you on what you need to do and look out for. The main thing is that we need to make sure Susan gets plenty of support when she discharged from our unit," said Dr. Matthews. Eve pressed her mobile close to her ear. The reception and signal was not so strong, so some words were being cut off from Dr. Matthews' replies. "Doctor, I am sorry, it keeps breaking up. How long is Susan in the ward for?" Eve asked. "Well, I gotta go back to finishing up a few things, but Susan was detained on a Section 5. She has agreed to be voluntary to see how things develop. She is a very strong person, so whatever happened must have been difficult for her." "Okay, Dr. Matthews, I have been trying to call and speak to her, but it has been difficult." "I understand, don't worry. These things take time. Let's see how she is in a few days' time. You are free to visit. You have been the only one checking in on her." "Thank you, doctor. You have put me at ease." Eve then finished up the mobile call and got up to go to lunch. That evening, Eve was back home reflecting on the day. She was tempted to ring Susan's mother to see if she was visiting her daughter on the mental health unit. Eve resisted the urge. She thought that it would not do any good. Eve thought that Janet would just get upset and angry. Perhaps Janet would just say something nasty and blame her for what happened. Eve was still unsure on how Susan took some lethal substance and how she ended up in hospital. At least things were looking up. As Dr. Matthews explained earlier that day, Susan must have been talking to them on how she would like to be supported when she was discharged from the unit. "It will be difficult. It is not going to be easy, but I won't let her down. I will fight for her." Eve turned on her laptop as she was watching TV. She searched on the internet for more information about caring for someone suffering forms of depression. Maybe that was her condition. If she took something, it might be depression. I just need as much information as possible. Eve clicked on a website called Mind and then clicked on another website called Sane. The websites were organized in clear detail. Eventually, Eve clicked on a website by Carers Trust. This website makes things a bit easier to understand what a carer is. Eve must have spent an hour going through the site. It helped that her internet was behaving itself and that the website loaded quickly and without problems. Eve took some of the information from the website and downloaded some files onto her laptop. "Oh, I am getting so tired. I think I will go to bed. I know it is early, but—" Eve shut down her laptop and turned off the TV. She slowly walked halfway up the steps until she could hear her mobile phone ringing. Eve rushed back downstairs to look at the mobile phone. It was a number she did not recognize. Who could this be at this time? I hope it is not a prank caller. Eve picked up her mobile phone to accept the call. "Hello, who is this?" Eve asked. "Is that Eve?" "Yes. Who is this?" Eve asked again. "I got your number from Susan. She said I should introduce myself to you. I am sorry, my name is Ishay. I am going to be working with Susan," said the social worker. "Oh, Susan, how is she?" said Eve. "Well, she is still unwell, but improving rapidly. I will be her social worker. I have just spoken to her on the ward. Listen, I hope it's okay that I call. I know it is early evening and all," the social worker responded. No, it is fine, Eshe. I'm glad you called. It's just I did not want to be kept in the dark, so I am delighted someone is updating me. Oh, thank you, anyway. We are looking forward to seeing you at the ward round next week, but I just wanted to ring ahead of time and introduce myself. I plan to see Susan during the home treatment team visits, said Ishi. Home treatment team? Queried Eve. Yes, they are assigned to a patient for a while when they are discharged. They will just want to make sure things are all right during the first few weeks. Oh, Ishi, just to let you know, I don't think Susan will be at her mother's. Yes, I was thinking the same. I don't think it is suitable for Susan to be there. It is a safeguarding risk. Any idea where Susan will live? Responded Isha. There was a pause on the mobile phone as Eve took a deep breath. Susan will be with me. I will take her in. Okay, Eve, let's discuss this with Susan. I am not sure what her plans are as yet. Okay, Miss Ishi, anyway. You know where I am and how you can reach me. Eve then hung up the call and took her mobile phone up to her bedroom. Eve put the mobile phone on charge and kept a close eye on the mobile phone in case it rang again. Eve knew it was another sign that things were hopeful, but Eve was worried what Janet would say. No way am I letting Susan go back to her mother's over my dead body. I will fight for her. Eve kept one eye on the mobile phone while she was in her bed, but the bed was so comfy it was difficult for Eve to stay awake. The next time she opened her eyes, it was early in the morning. Eve leapt up to check for any missed calls, but nothing. Eve got up and headed off to work. On her way to work, Eve was in a slightly bad mood. It did not help that the traffic was not going anywhere, and other drivers were cutting her off. She was frustrated that she fell asleep so quickly because so much was at stake. If Susan was going to ring Eve and she was unable to answer, would that mean Susan could not rely on her anymore? Eve did not want to make mistakes, even if she felt she was being hard on herself. Eve knew that Susan was in a volatile place and that she would have to make sure things were covered. The day at work passed quickly because a lot of the time Eve spent concentrating on Susan's situation. No word or call came back from the mental health hospital. You know what? I think I am going to pay them a visit after work. Eve looked into her bag and checked the opening times of Ashburn Mental Health Unit. I'm glad I still have this leaflet nearby. I would be lost without, although I guess I could search for the hospital opening times off my mobile phone. Eve put the leaflet away as she noted down in the opening times of the mental health unit. Eve decided she will visit Susan after work, although she felt apprehensive. In the back of Eve's mind, she felt unsure how things would go. Would Susan end up like she did on Eve's first visit? Eve did remember what Susan had said off the phone call a few days ago. No, I have got to be strong. I have got to see what the developments are. Eve looked at the time off her mobile phone. It was nearly closing time, and Eve got out of the office and headed towards the hospital. It was almost second nature in finding the hospital, even though Eve only had visited the mental health unit once. Eve was determined to see this through. It would be Eve's way of proving her love for Susan. If you love someone, then you have got to be there for them. There is no other way. Eve picked up her speed in the car and continued on her journey to the hospital. She was still in two minds, but she wanted answers to prepare for the ward round. Would Susan be happy to see Eve? Would things just fall apart? What if Susan's mother was there? Soon Eve arrived at the hospital. She had no problems in finding the way to the unit, but the closer she got to the mental health unit, the slower she walked. There was something tugging at the back of Eve's mind. It was always the same. She kept thinking of the worst, but this time she had to prove herself. She had to make a difference. She had to do this for Susan. Eve found herself outside the hospital ward. She rang the buzzer and waited. Eve waited and waited, but no response. Eve pressed the buzzer again. Eve peered through the door window to see a figure sitting in the hallway. The figure looked up at the door where Eve was peering through. Suddenly, the figure shouted at the staff. My God, why don't someone get the door? Hard to get out of this place, hard to get into this place unless they think you are mad. Eve stepped back from the door. The voice of the patient was familiar. It was Wendy, the patient she saw when she visited Susan for the first time. It was not long before Eve could hear some jangling of some keys. There were several clicks of the keyhole, and then the door opened. "Hello, who have you come to see?" asked the ward staff. "I have come to see Susan," Eve replied. "Okay, come in. I think she is in the restroom." Eve patiently followed the nurse into the restroom. Eve could see Susan watching TV. Her hair seemed combed, which was a good sign. Eve was not sure what to say until the male nurse spoke instead. Susan, you have a visitor. Do you want to go into the visitor's room?" Susan looked up at Eve and smiled what seemed like a weak smile. "Eve, I'm glad you dropped by to see me. How are you?" smiled Susan. Eve was in shock. This was a completely different Susan compared to the visit she made a while ago. Eve thought things would change since the last visit, but she was wondering if the change would be worse rather than some form of improvement. Still, Eve was not completely convinced. This visit only had begun, and anything could change at the last moment. "It's okay, nurse. I am enjoying this program, and we will just talk a little quiet," said Susan. There were other patients in the room. They seemed tired and annoyed, but all voiced that they were happy to have more people in the room. A few of the patients sat in the corner, not paying much attention to anything. Eve sat down next to Susan, quietly not saying much of a word. She was not sure how the other patients would act. Eve felt bad thinking this way. She did not want anyone to get into an argument. Within a couple of seconds, Susan put her arms around Eve as she sat to watch the drama on TV. The volume of the TV was quite low, and Eve wondered how on earth Susan was managing to listen to the TV. It did not help that some patients were talking about their troubles in the background. Eve eventually put her arm over Susan's shoulder, but she still said nothing. "Well," said Susan. Eve looked at Susan bemused. "How was your day?" Susan asked. "Oh, I spent the day worrying about you, Susan. I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did this happen?" Susan looked down on the floor. Her smile disappeared. "My mother." "Oh, Susan, I am sorry. I asked too soon." "No, Eve, don't worry. You need to know I was in such a dark place. It just came on without warning, my despair. Janet kept on and on at me, and something clicked." Eve did not say anything, but continued to listen to Susan. "For years I have been unsure of myself. For years I did not know how to be happy," Susan said. "It was until I met you, Eve. I felt for the first time I had something to work for, to live for. My mother did not like my decisions. You know my mother is so religious." "Yes, Susan, I hope you did not mind. I called Janet to try find out what happened." "Yes, Eve, I know. I also called Janet to try get my things here. She told me you called her. No surprise that she argued with me over the phone." "I am sorry, Susan. I did not know how bad things were between you and your mother. If I had known—" Susan then interrupted Eve. "No, I should have said at the start of our relationship, it was not fair on you. I knew full well Janet would not accept this. She took out her disappointments on me. I snapped, and that's when it happened. I was alone and wanted my life to end. It was the heat of the moment." Eve's face went red. She was about to burst into tears. Hearing Susan suddenly open up to her, Eve felt guilty. If only she was there to save Susan from Janet's anger. All those years Susan suffered from her abusive mother. Eve promised to herself things would need to change, starting now. "Susan, look, your ward round is coming up. You mentioned it was all right if I was to attend?" "Yes, I had a ward round last week. They kept me in here since they were worried I might do this again. But to be honest, taking your life is just the easy way out. There is no answer if you manage to take your life. Well, it is the worst thing to be doing," Susan responded to Eve. Susan turned her head back to the television. "It is true, though. I need help, Eve. I just cannot go back to my mother's." "I know, Susan. I want you to move in with me. We can start again without blame, without pain, and we can make a future before someone takes it away from us. I love you and want to be there for you," Eve pleaded. "It will be difficult, Eve. They will always hate us. If not my mother, someone else. Society, I don't know." "I know, Susan. We got to try. I love you, and to prove it, I am here." Eve smiled. Susan seemed to ignore Eve as she continued to watch the television. Eve waited for her answer and seemed quite astounded how Susan could even hear the television. The volume seemed so low. It was only until Susan cuddled up to Eve and squeezed her arm that Eve felt reassured that Susan wanted Eve to be there for her. About 30 minutes later, Eve told Susan she had to go home and get some rest. Susan just nodded to Eve. "See you next time, Eve." "Don't worry, Susan. Everything will be all right." Eve made her way towards the ward exit, but as usual had to wait to be let out. At home, Eve was sitting thinking to herself. She never attended a ward round before. She did not know what to expect when talking to mental health professionals. What do I say to them? What questions would they ask me? What if I say something stupid and upset Susan? She has only just began to open up to me. Eve kept thinking things over again and again. She just was not sure what to say. How would Susan's mother behave if she knew her daughter was going to stay with me? Eve wondered to herself. Eve mustered up the courage and dialed Janet's number. She still felt that Susan's mother was angry, but she to lay things down. She had to say to Janet that she was going to take over. She had to say to Janet that she will be the carer. Just then, a voice came out from the mobile phone. "Hello, who is this?" "Hi, Janet, it's me, Eve." "Oh, you again? What do you want? Haven't you done enough damage already?" "Janet, I visited Susan again." "So, you just can't leave her alone, can you?" Janet complained. "Janet, listen, Susan has told me what happened." "What do you mean?" Janet barked. "About the time when Susan almost took her life, about the things you accused her of." Janet laughed. "So she is telling her lies again? You both are ganging up on me, trying to pin the blame on me." "No, Janet, just listen. I want to say that Susan will be moving in with me. I will look after her." "Good. You two deserve each other. You both can rot in hell." Eve could hear the phone line cut off. Obviously, Janet disconnected the call, but to be honest, Eve said her piece. She was not going to call Janet for a very long time. Eve needed to heal from the difficult conversation. Eve could feel proud of herself that she stood up for Susan and stood up for herself. It was a good sign that Eve was confident of herself. "I don't care what Janet says. I don't care what the world says. I am proud of who I am. I am going to love and care for Susan. That's the way it should be," Eve thought to herself. Eve turned on the TV to clear her thoughts for the rest of the day. She felt she had to enjoy something. It was a week later that Eve was back at the mental health ward over at the hospital. It was the big day, the day of the ward round. Eve was waiting outside the patient unit where she sat outside the meeting room. They are taking their time in there, Eve wondered. She was waiting for the meeting to finish so that she could go in and explain her plan for Susan and herself. Just then, the door opened. A patient from the unit came out crying from the office. "You all are just evil torturers. Why can't you let me leave? Why keep me in this place?" Eve looked away from the patient. She did not want to get involved, but she had a good idea why the patient was crying. Eve understood that the section the patient was under did not get revoked. The patient wanted to go home, but someone in that meeting refused the order. Just then, the office door opened again. A lady appeared in the office doorway. "Would you want to come in?" Eve took a deep breath and quickly got up. She then entered the room to see 3 people sitting down. One person was on laptop taking notes. Another person looked up at Eve and smiled. The lady who asked Eve to enter the room closed the door and sat down. Eve also sat down and faced what looked to be the psychiatrist. "Are you Dr. Matthews?" Eve asked. "Oh, you guessed correctly. Thanks for coming, Eve. I am Susan's mental health doctor." The person who smiled at Eve earlier introduced himself. "Hi, Eve. I am Stephen, a mental health advocate." Just then, another voice spoke out as an introduction. It was the woman who asked Eve to enter the office. "Hello, my name is Eshe. I am Susan's care coordinator. We spoke earlier. Pleased to meet you." Eve smiled nervously. "I am so sorry. I only just about understand your roles. What do you all do?" Dr. Matthews smiled at Eve. "I am just here to support the patient and her carer. I only want what is best for her and want to work in a way where Susan can manage her condition." Dr. Matthews then turned to Stephen. "I am an independent mental health advocate. I am here to support Susan with her queries and concerns, but I also want to explain to Susan her mental health rights. I am also here if you have any questions." It was then Eshi's turn to speak. I am Ishi. I am here to support Susan's out in the community. I want to draw up a care plan between you and Susan. I hear from Susan that you will be looking after her. Yes, it's just I am not sure how everything will go. All this is so new to me. I am not sure what to do as a carer. Dr. Matthews looked at Eve. You mean unpaid or informal carer? Unpaid? Eve looked in confusion. Yes, you care for Susan differently compared to a care worker. You care for Susan for different reasons. It is a circular purpose. You care because you care, the doctor replied. Eve pondered over Dr. Matthews' explanation. She sort of understood the term, but she still could not comprehend the role of a carer. There are some booklets I can hand out to you, Eve. It is what our mental health NHS organization provides for carers, Eshi said in a confident tone. Just then, Ishi stood up and headed towards the door. Dr. Matthews looked at Eshe. You are going to bring Susan in then? Yes, Dr. Matthews. Dr. Matthews then looked at Eve with a smile. How has Susan been while you have been visiting her? Eve spoke in a nervous tone. Oh, at first she did not make much sense. It was all too much for her. But now she has begun to open up to me. I think things are progressing confidently. I still think there are some unforeseen difficulties, but she has explained slightly how she ended up here. Dr. Matthews nodded. He picked up some files off the table and studied them. They were obviously Susan's patient notes. The room went silent while Dr. Matthews continued to look at the notes. Eve could hear someone typing furiously on the other side of the room. It was someone taking minutes of the meeting. How long do you think Susan will be here, if you don't mind me asking? Eve asked the doctor. We will need to see how Susan is at our ward round. Then I think we can discharge her. Depends how she is. Just then, the door opened and Susan stepped in. She seemed a little tired, but smiled a weak smile towards Eve. Susan shuffled her feet slightly towards Eve and sat down next to her. Hello, Eve. Thank you for coming. I am sorry I am so tired. Susan smiled. It's okay, Susan. I told you that I would be there for you, Eve whispered. Okay, Susan. Glad you could join us. How have things been for you this past week? Asked the doctor. Oh, I have been so tired, doctor. I think my medication, it is a little high. Apart from that, I have been doing some activities. I like the art sessions. I feel I am creative, said Susan. Dr. Matthews nodded and looked at the patient notes again. Dr. Matthews, you reckon I will be discharged? I have been given some leave, but I just cannot go back to my mother's. Yes, I am aware of that, Susan. I believe it was mentioned that your friend Eve will support you. My girlfriend, Susan corrected the doctor. Oh, sorry, Susan. Okay, I understand. Eve smiled. Yes, I am going to be there for her. If I was there earlier, I don't think none of this would have happened. Susan looked at Eve. No, Eve, it is not your fault. I was not being honest about the situation. I was not being honest about myself. I am sorry that I did this, but with the help, I am sure I can make a road to recovery. Dr. Matthews looked at Susan and nodded. That sounds very confident. Do you know why you ended up here? Yes, I tried to commit suicide after a row with my mother. Okay, let's leave it at that. I don't want to make things traumatic, but do take note that any other activity like that can bring you back here. Yes, Dr. Matthews, I understand, but I still need help. I still have unresolved issues. Dr. Matthews nodded again and put the patient's files back into a folder on the table. Dr. Matthews then explained to Susan and Eve that medication will continue to be given, but after a while the dosage would be reduced if things progressed well in the community. Do I have to monitor the dosage, especially side effects? Eve asked the doctor. I will do that, Eshe interrupted. No, I don't think it is that simple, Eshe, Stephen spoke quickly. I feel not only Eve has to check for anything, but also Susan. It is a joint effort. Remember, Ishi is not going to be there 24/7. It will be Eve most of the time. Yes, I will need my girlfriend's help, Susan interrupted. The room went quiet again. Susan looked at Eve with her tired eyes. Eve, you will look after me? Yes, Susan, always. I don't know what the future will bring. We can only try, Eve. Susan laid back into the chair, feeling tired. Okay, listen, I am confident that Susan can be discharged from the ward. Eshe will be working with the both of you. If there are any problems, Ishi can be your point of contact. But Eve, please also speak to our ward pharmacist. And also, we do have a carer's surgery if you want to drop by one day. We run that surgery on Wednesday evening. Okay, Dr. Matthews. The next day, Susan was at Eve's place. Eve was slightly excited to be living with Susan, but worried about the future. She was also worried about picking up Susan's belongings from Janet. Eve knew that Janet will try to start an argument, but Eve was determined to see things through. Susan? Yes, Eve. I know it is a little late, but would you like to go out for a bit? Sure, why not? Where do you think we should go? How about that park? The sun is shining and all, we should take advantage of it. Susan smiled. She still seemed tired, but she was glad to spend time with Eve. They both went outside and headed to the park. 20 minutes later, they were sitting on the park bench. Eve and Susan watched the children play. The children laughed and made so much noise, they seemed so innocent to the world. The sun was shining down on Eve's face that she could barely see, but she did not mind as Susan cuddled up close to her. I am so tired, Eve. I hope you don't mind if I sleep a bit. No, love, I don't mind. I don't mind one bit. Go ahead and sleep. And with that, Susan fell asleep in Eve's arms. Eve suddenly knew what caring can bring to a close relationship. She knew things would not be easy, but maybe there will always be some form of hope.